Commander, Module 7. Kowalski is down. There's blood on the airlock panel. He's not breathing.
That transmission hasn't been sent yet, but it will be. Maybe in 15 years, maybe in 20, a human being will die on Mars, at the hands of another human being. And the moment it happens, it will expose the strangest gap in modern civilization. We built laws for every continent on Earth, for the open ocean, for the skies above us, even for the space stations circling in low orbit. But for Mars, the planet we are actively planning to colonize, we built nothing. Here is the paradox. Right now, at this very moment, engineers are designing the habitats that will house the first Martian settlers. Scientists are testing the life support systems that will keep them breathing. Billions of dollars are flowing into rockets, powerful enough to carry human beings to another world. Every technical challenge, radiation shielding, food production, water recycling, energy generation, is being attacked with the full force of human ingenuity. Entire careers are being dedicated to solving the engineering puzzle of keeping people alive on a planet with almost no atmosphere and surface temperatures that drop to minus 130 degrees. But the question of what happens when someone commits a crime inside one of those habitats, that question sits untouched, gathering dust. We are building a city on another world, and we forgot to build the courthouse. This might sound hypothetical. It isn't. NASA is targeting crewed Mars missions in the 2030s. SpaceX is constructing the Starship rocket specifically for Mars colonization. China's space program has published its own crewed Mars timeline. The first humans to walk on Martian soil are probably alive right now, possibly in their 20s, possibly already training. The rockets are being built, the habitats are being tested, and the legal vacuum waiting for those people when they arrive is just as real as the engineering blueprints sitting on a desk at mission control. So, let's look at what that vacuum actually means. On Earth, if someone is murdered in Tokyo, Japanese law applies. If it happens in Sao Paulo, Brazilian law takes over. Every crime on this planet happens within some nation's borders, and that nation's courts handle the case. This principle, territorial jurisdiction, is the bedrock of criminal law. It has been for centuries. Every courtroom, every prosecutor, every prison sentence traces its authority back to one simple idea. The ground beneath your feet belongs to a government, and that government makes the rules. Mars erases that idea completely. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty, signed by over 100 nations, explicitly forbids any country from claiming sovereignty over a celestial body. Mars belongs to all of humanity, and in legal terms, that means it belongs to no one. The very foundation that criminal law rests on dissolves the moment you step onto Martian soil. There is ground, there are footprints, but there is no jurisdiction beneath them. A partial safety net exists. Article 8 of the same treaty says, a country retains jurisdiction over objects and personnel it launches into space. So, if NASA sends an American astronaut to Mars, that astronaut theoretically remains under American law, the same way a sailor on a US flagged ship in the middle of the Pacific still answers to American courts. That sounds workable, until you look at what a real Mars base will actually be. Ares Base, the scenario we're going to walk through, has 14 crew members from 8 different countries. The habitat modules were manufactured by an American private company. The rocket that delivered them was European. The funding came from a multinational team of 12 nations and 4 corporations. The victim, Tomasz Kowalski, is a Polish engineer. The woman kneeling next to his body, Dr. Lena Vasquez, is French. The mission commander, Chen Wei, holds Chinese-Canadian dual citizenship. So, When Kowalski's blood appears on that airlock panel, which country's law applies? America's, because the habitat was built by an American company. Poland's, because the victim is Polish. France's, because the person who reported it is French. Canada's or China's, because the commander holds 2 passports. Every single one of those claims has a legal foundation. And that is precisely why none of them work. When 5 nations can all argue they have authority, the arguments cancel each other out. Jurisdiction doesn't multiply, it paralyzes. And while international lawyers on Earth begin what could take years to resolve, the crew of Ares Base is sealed inside a habitat the size of a few shipping containers on a planet where the next launch window, home, is 11 months away. The suspect, the witnesses, the commander, the person who found the body. They all breathe the same recycled air. They eat at the same table. There is no separation. There is no escape. But the jurisdiction crisis isn't even the hardest part. The suspect, a Russian engineer named Andrei Volkov, has been restrained by Commander Chen and confined to a storage bay in Module 3. There is no courtroom on Mars. There is no defense attorney. There is no jury. Communication delay between Mars and Earth ranges anywhere from 4 to 24 minutes, one way, meaning a simple legal question. And its answer can take nearly an hour. A real-time trial is physically impossible. And here is where the situation turns from difficult to genuinely unsolvable. Andrei Volkov is the only person on Ares Base trained to maintain the water recycling system. 3 weeks after he's locked away, a critical filtration unit fails. Commander Chen now faces a decision that no earthly judge has ever confronted. Release the man's suspected of murder to repair the system, keeping 14 people alive, or keep him confined and watch the colony's water supply collapse. On Earth, a convicted killer can be removed from society. The world goes on without them. On Mars, in these early years, every crew member is a load-bearing pillar. Each one represents irreplaceable expertise, a decade of specialized training, and a critical link in the chain that keeps the entire colony breathing and drinking and eating. Remove one person from the equation, and the equation starts to fail. This is the story of that equation breaking. A body in Module 7, a suspect in Module 3, a commander making decisions no protocol ever anticipated, and 2 planets, one watching from 225 million kilometers away, the other trapped inside a pressurized tin can, both arriving at the same terrifying realization. We spent decades figuring out how to get humans to Mars. We spent almost no time thinking about what happens when humans start acting like humans after they arrive. The distance between Earth and Mars, at its closest approach, is roughly 55 million kilometers. Light needs over 3 minutes just to cross that gap. To put that in perspective, if you stacked 55 million kilometers in commercial flights, you'd circle the Earth nearly 1,400 times. But the real distance isn't measured in kilometers or orbits. The real distance is the one between the world we wrote our laws for and the world we're about to inhabit. A gap where the rules of civilization simply end. And something we haven't written yet will have to take their place. This is that gap. And as of today, nobody on either planet knows how to close it. The year is 1967. The Cold War has the world split in 2. The United States and the Soviet Union aren't just competing on Earth anymore. They're racing upward, throwing satellites, capsules, and human beings into orbit at a pace that terrifies both sides equally. And the fear isn't just about who gets to the moon first. The fear is about what comes after. Because in 1967, both superpowers realize something chilling. If one side puts a nuclear warhead in orbit, the other side will have roughly 6 minutes of warning before annihilation. 6 minutes. That's less time than it takes to brew a cup of coffee. So, the world's governments do something remarkable. They sit down, Americans, Soviets, and eventually over 100 other nations, and they write a treaty, the Outer Space Treaty. Formally, it's called the Treaty on Principles, governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. Nobody calls it that. Everyone just calls it the Outer Space Treaty. And in 1967, it is considered a triumph of diplomacy. A moment where Cold War rivals agree in writing that space will be used for peaceful purposes. The treaty does its job beautifully for the problem it was built to solve. It bans nuclear weapons in orbit. It prohibits military bases on the moon. It declares that the exploration of space shall be carried out for the benefit of all countries. These are broad, elegant principles, and they work precisely because they are broad and elegant. The treaty isn't trying to govern the details of daily life in space. It's trying to keep two superpowers from turning the sky into a war zone. On that count, it succeeds spectacularly. For nearly 60 years, no nation has placed a weapon of mass destruction in orbit. The Outer Space Treaty is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most successful arms control agreements in human history. But here's the thing about a lock designed to keep out missiles. It doesn't work very well against a murder. The treaty's most important article, at least for our story, is Article 2. It is one sentence long, and it reshapes everything. It states that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. Read that again carefully. No nation can own any part of space. No government can plant a flag on Mars and declare it sovereign territory. The surface of Mars, under international law, belongs to the entire human race, collectively, which, in the language of courts and prosecutors, means it belongs to no one at all. This distinction matters enormously, and it matters because of how criminal law has functioned for the entire history of organized civilization. Every legal system on Earth rests on a single foundational idea: sovereignty. A government claims a piece of land. Within that land, it writes laws. It builds courts. It trains police. It constructs prisons. When a crime occurs, the government of that territory investigates, prosecutes, and punishes. This chain, from sovereign land to functioning justice, is so deeply embedded in how we think about law that most people never even question it. You commit a crime in Germany, German law applies. You commit a crime in Japan, Japanese law applies. The ground under your feet determines whose rules you follow. Mars has no such ground. The soil is real. The rocks are real. The dust storms are real. But the legal authority beneath all of it is simply absent. Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty made sure of that, intentionally and permanently. The diplomats who wrote it were thinking about preventing colonial land grabs in space, the same way European empires had carved up Africa and the Americas centuries earlier. They wanted to ensure that no nation could claim the moon or Mars the way Spain once claimed South America, and they succeeded. But in doing so, they also removed the one thing criminal law cannot function without. Imagine building a hospital with every piece of medical equipment known to science: operating tables, MRI machines, surgical robots, and then forgetting to connect it to a power grid. Everything is there. Everything looks functional. But the moment you need it to actually work, you discover that the single thing making all of it operational was never installed. That's what Article 2 did to criminal jurisdiction on Mars. It removed the power supply. The treaty's authors weren't careless. They anticipated that people and objects would exist in space, and they needed some mechanism to maintain order. That mechanism is Article 8. It states that a country retains jurisdiction and control over any object launched into outer space and over any personnel aboard that object. This is the legal thread that connects astronauts to Earth. If NASA launches a spacecraft, that spacecraft, and everyone inside it, remains under United States jurisdiction. If the European Space Agency launches a satellite, that satellite is governed by the laws of the ESA member states. The principle mirrors something very old in legal tradition, the law of the flag, borrowed directly from maritime law. For centuries, ships sailing in international waters, where no nation has sovereignty, have been governed by the laws of the country whose flag they fly. A British-flagged ship in the middle of the Atlantic operates under British law, even though the ocean beneath it belongs to no one. Article 8 applies the same logic to space. Your spacecraft is your territory. Your flag follows you into the void. And for decades, this works. It works for the International Space Station. It works for satellites. It works for short-duration missions where a handful of astronauts from cooperating nations spend a few months in orbit before returning home. The legal questions that arise are manageable because the situations are manageable. Crews are small. Missions are temporary. Communication with Earth is nearly instant. If something goes wrong, truly wrong, a crew member can be back on the ground within hours. The system holds because the pressures against it are light. Mars changes the pressure entirely. Article 8 assumes that a spacecraft is essentially a vessel. Something built by one nation, registered to one nation, crewed by people who can be neatly categorized under one nation's authority. That assumption disintegrates the moment you look at how a real Mars mission will be structured. The international cooperation required to put humans on Mars is staggering. A single habitat module might contain components manufactured in 4 different countries, assembled in a 5th, launched on a rocket built by a 6th, and funded by a consortium that includes both governments and private corporations from a dozen more. The clean, single flag model of Article 8. One object, one nation, one jurisdiction, shatters into a mosaic of overlapping claims that nobody in 1967 could have predicted. Because nobody in 1967 was thinking about permanent settlements on another planet. They were thinking about flags on the moon and missiles in orbit. There is one more layer to this, and it is perhaps the most unsettling. Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty states that nations bear international responsibility for all national activities in outer space, whether carried out by governmental agencies or by non-governmental entities. In plain language, if a private American company sends people to Mars, the United States government is responsible for what that company does. This was a forward-thinking provision in 1967, when the very idea of private spaceflight was science fiction. Today, with SpaceX, Blue Origin, and a growing fleet of commercial space companies actively building Mars-capable hardware, Article FIG has become the single most ambiguous clause in the entire treaty. Responsibility is a broad word. It can mean oversight. It can mean regulation. It can mean liability. What it does not mean, and has never meant, is direct governance. The United States is responsible for SpaceX's activities in space. But that does not make a SpaceX habitat on Mars a piece of American territory. Article 2 still forbids that. So you have a bizarre legal construction. The US is responsible for what happens inside the habitat but has no sovereign authority over the ground it sits on. The company that built the habitat owns the structure as property, but cannot claim the land beneath it. And the people living inside exist in a jurisdiction that is simultaneously American, international, corporate, and non-existent, depending on which article of which treaty you choose to read. Legal scholars have a term for this kind of situation. They call it a lacuna, a gap in the law where the rules simply stop and no clear authority fills the void. The Outer Space Treaty is full of lacunae, placed there deliberately by diplomats who knew they couldn't predict the future and chose vague language over specific rules. In 1967, that was wise. Vague language allowed the treaty to survive for decades without needing constant revision. But vague language is exactly the wrong tool for criminal law, which demands precision. Criminal law needs to answer specific questions. Who has authority? What is the procedure? What are the rights of the accused? What punishments are permissible? The Outer Space Treaty answers none of these. It was never supposed to. And here's where the timeline becomes alarming. Amending the Outer Space Treaty requires consensus among all signatory nations. Over 100 countries, each with their own political priorities, legal traditions, and strategic interests. In the history of space law, no major amendment to the Outer Space Treaty has ever been successfully adopted. The last serious attempt to expand space governance, the 1979 Moon Agreement, tried to establish a framework for managing natural resources on celestial bodies. It was rejected by every major spacefaring nation. The United States didn't sign it. The Soviet Union didn't sign it. China didn't sign it. The Moon Agreement is technically in force, ratified by a handful of small nations with no space programs. It is, for all practical purposes, a dead letter. This means the legal architecture governing human activity on Mars in the 2030s and 2040s will almost certainly be the same architecture written in 1967. A framework designed for a world where space meant orbit, astronauts numbered in the dozens, and the idea of a permanent human settlement on another planet was a fantasy relegated to paperback novels. The lawyers know this, the space agencies know this, the diplomats know this. And yet the rockets keep getting built, the missions keep getting planned, and the legal gap keeps getting wider. At Ares Base, 14 people from 8 countries are about to discover what that gap feels like from the inside. A body is cooling in Module 7. A commander is on the radio to Houston, and the most sophisticated legal civilization in human history is about to learn that its laws end at the edge of Earth's atmosphere. And that beyond that edge, the word justice doesn't have a definition yet. The Outer Space Treaty kept nuclear weapons out of orbit. It prevented a colonial scramble for the moon. It held the peace between superpowers for 6 decades. It is, by almost every measure, a masterpiece of Cold War diplomacy. It just wasn't built for blood. Dr. Lina Vasquez hasn't moved in 4 minutes. She's kneeling on the cold composite floor of Module 7, both hands pressed against Tomasz Kowalski's chest. And she already knows it's too late. His skin is gray. The blood on the airlock panel has started to dry into a dark, copper-colored smear that runs from the handle down to the seal. The module smells like iron and recycled air. Lina is the mission's medical officer. She has trained for decompression injuries, bone fractures from low gravity, cardiac events triggered by cosmic radiation. She has rehearsed emergency protocols for every physiological disaster that Mars can inflict on a human body. She has never been trained for this. The sight of a colleague lying dead with injuries that no accident could explain. Her hands are shaking. She reaches for the comm panel.
Commander, this is Dr. Lina Vasquez at Module 7. I need you to send someone here. Now! Kowalski isn't breathing. There's blood on the airlock panel. I don't think this was an accident.
Silence. 4 seconds of dead air that feel like 40. Then the commander's voice, steady but tight.
Copy, Lina. Do not touch anything else. I'm on my way. Keep the module sealed.
On Earth, this moment would trigger a precise and well-rehearsed machine. Police would arrive within minutes. A forensic team would seal the crime scene with tape and plastic sheeting. Detectives would begin interviewing witnesses. The body would be photographed from every angle, then transported to a medical examiner's facility for autopsy. Evidence: fingerprints, DNA, fiber samples, digital records would be catalogued, sealed in bags, and entered into a chain of custody that defense attorneys would later scrutinize down to the minute. A prosecutor would open a file. A judge would be assigned. Within hours of a body being discovered on Earth, the full machinery of criminal justice would be in motion, powered by centuries of procedure and the authority of a sovereign government. On Mars, Commander Chen Wei walks into Module 7 with a tablet and a flashlight. He is a mission commander, not a detective. His training covers emergency triage, crew psychology, habitat maintenance protocols, and communications with mission control. He can diagnose a reactor anomaly. He can manage a crew through a dust storm that lasts 3 weeks. He has never processed a crime scene. He has never preserved forensic evidence. He has never questioned a suspect under conditions that would hold up in any courtroom on Earth or anywhere else. And yet, in this moment, he is the closest thing to law enforcement that exists on an entire planet. Chen does what instinct and basic training tell him to do. He orders the crew to stay in their assigned modules. He photographs the body and the blood pattern on the airlock panel using his tablet. He checks the habitat's internal surveillance system. 4 cameras cover the common areas, but Module 7 has only one, positioned near the entrance. And its footage from the last 6 hours shows a 4-minute gap where the feed cuts to static. Whether that gap is a malfunction or something deliberate, Chen can't determine. He doesn't have the technical expertise to analyze corrupted video files, and the person on the crew who does. The communications specialist, a German engineer named Klaus Richter, is also a potential witness who was seen arguing with Kowalski 2 days earlier. This is the first fracture in what will become a cascading structural failure. On Earth, the people who investigate crimes are separated from the people involved in them. Police officers don't investigate murders committed by their own family members. Forensic analysts don't examine evidence collected by suspects. The entire architecture of criminal investigations depends on a wall between the investigators and the investigated. A wall built from institutional independence, staffing depth, and the simple mathematical fact that in a city of millions, you can always find someone impartial. Ares Base has 14 people. 14. Every one of them knew Kowalski. Every one of them has a relationship, professional, personal, or both, with every other crew member. The commander investigating the death has shared meals with every potential suspect for nearly 2 years. The medical officer examining the body trained alongside. The victim during pre-mission preparation in Houston. The communications specialist who might analyze the surveillance footage had a documented conflict with the deceased. Impartiality isn't compromised on Mars. Impartiality doesn't exist on Mars. The concept requires a distance between people that a 14-person sealed habitat on a dead planet simply cannot provide. Chen finishes his preliminary documentation and opens a channel to Earth.
Houston, this is Commander Chen at Ares Base. I have a crew fatality in Module 7. Tomas Kowalski, mission engineer, deceased. Injuries are inconsistent with any mechanical or environmental cause. I am treating this as a potential homicide. Requesting legal guidance and investigative protocol. Over.
Then he waits. And this is where Mars reveals another dimension of the problem. That no Earth-based legal framework was built to handle the delay. The speed of light is the fastest anything can travel in the universe, when known. At the moment of Kowalski's death, Mars is approximately 19 light minutes from Earth. Chen's transmission, traveling at 300,000 kilometers per second, takes 19 minutes to reach Houston. Mission Control receives it, absorbs the shock, and begins scrambling for a response. That response takes another 19 minutes to travel back. 38 minutes, minimum, for a single exchange. And that's the current orbital geometry. At other points in Mars's orbit, the delay stretches to 48 minutes round trip. During solar conjunction, when the Sun sits directly between Earth and Mars, communication becomes impossible entirely for roughly 2 weeks. Think about what that means in practical terms. On Earth, a detective at a murder scene can call the district attorney's office and have a legal question answered in minutes. A forensic team can consult with a laboratory in real time. A judge can issue a search warrant within the hour. Every step of a criminal investigation relies on rapid, fluid communications between people with different expertise. The investigator, the prosecutor, the forensic specialist, the judge. That fluidity is so fundamental that no one even thinks about it. It's like oxygen. You don't notice it until it's gone. On Mars, it's gone. Every question Chen asks takes nearly 40 minutes to produce an answer. Every instruction from Mission Control arrives long after the moment it was needed. If Houston tells Chen to preserve a specific piece of evidence, that instruction arrives 19 minutes after it was sent. And by then, Chen may have already moved the body, cleaned the module, or allowed crew members into the area. The crime scene is degrading in real time, and the expertise that could prevent that degradation is trapped on a planet 200 million kilometers away, screaming instructions into a void that swallows 19 minutes from every sentence. The only existing model for managing crime in space is the International Space Station, and it's worth understanding exactly how that model works, and exactly why it crumbles under the conditions Mars imposes. In 1998, the nations that built the ISS signed an intergovernmental agreement that included, among many other provisions, a framework for criminal jurisdiction. The principle is elegant in its simplicity. Each partner nation retains jurisdiction over its own nationals. If a Canadian astronaut commits a crime aboard the station, Canada prosecutes. If a Japanese astronaut is accused of misconduct, Japan handles it. The nationality of the individual determines whose courts have authority. Clean, straightforward, functional. It works on the ISS for 3 very specific reasons. First, the crew is small, typically 6 to 12 people, most of whom come from the same handful of cooperating nations: the United States, Russia, Japan, Canada, and the European partner states. The jurisdictional math is simple because the number of variables is small. Second, communication with Earth is nearly instantaneous. The ISS orbits at roughly 400 kilometers above Earth's surface, and the signal delay is negligible. Less than a second. If a legal question arises, Mission Control can respond in real time. Ground-based legal teams can participate actively. Third, and most critically, evacuation is fast. A Soyuz capsule or a Crew Dragon spacecraft is always docked at the station. If something goes catastrophically wrong, if a crew member becomes dangerous, that person can be back on Earth within hours. The physical proximity to Earth's legal systems is the invisible scaffolding that holds everything together. Strip all 3 of those supports away, and you have Mars. Ares Base doesn't have 6 people from 4 countries. It has 14 people from 8. The United States, France, Poland, Russia, China, Germany, Brazil, and Canada. Some crew members hold dual citizenship. The mission commander has 2 passports. The nationality principle that works so cleanly on the ISS becomes a jurisdictional maze the moment you apply it to a crew this diverse. Under the ISS model, if Russian engineer Andrei Volkov is the suspect, Russia prosecutes. But Volkov is on a habitat built by an American company, launched by a European rocket, funded by a consortium in which Russia is a minor partner. Poland, Kowalski's home nation, demands involvement because the victim was Polish. France insists on participating because Lina Vasquez, the key witness, is French. China and Canada both have a claim through Commander Chen's dual citizenship. And the American company that built the habitat argues that its corporate jurisdiction applies to all events occurring within its property. The ISS model assumes these collisions won't happen because the crew is small and the nations are cooperating closely. Mars guarantees these collisions will happen because the crews are large, the missions are international, and the stakes, years of isolation, billions, in investment, national prestige, make every government involved reluctant to yield authority. Communication delay kills the ISS model's second pillar. On the station, ground teams can guide astronauts through any situation in real time. Legal advisors can listen in. Agency directors can make calls. The human chain between space and Earth is continuous and responsive. On Mars, that chain has a 19-minute gap in every link. Ground teams can advise, but they cannot guide. They can react, but only to situations that have already evolved far beyond the moment they were reported. The real-time partnership between crew and ground that defines ISS operations is physically impossible on Mars. The crew is alone in every meaningful sense. And the third pillar, evacuation, doesn't just weaken on Mars. It vanishes entirely. The ISS can send someone home in hours. Mars cannot send anyone home for months. Launch windows between Mars and Earth open roughly every 26 months, and even within a window, the transit time is 6 to 9 months. If the murder happens 2 weeks after the launch window closes, which is exactly the scenario at Ares Base, the suspect, the witnesses, the commander, and the victim's colleagues are all sealed together for nearly a year. There is no extraction team. There is no emergency shuttle. The distance isn't just a logistical challenge. It is a physical law. Orbital mechanics doesn't care about murder investigations. The planets move when the planets move, and human justice has to wait. This creates a situation that has no true precedent in legal history. The closest analogies: Antarctic research stations, nuclear submarines, remote oil platforms, all share some features of isolation, small crews, and limited communication. But every one of those analogies breaks on the question of extraction. An Antarctic station can be reached by aircraft within days. A submarine can surface and rendezvous with a ship. An oil platform is connected to the mainland by helicopter. Mars offers none of these options. The isolation is absolute and non-negotiable, governed by the mechanics of planetary orbits, rather than weather or logistics. And inside that isolation, the evidence is deteriorating. Module 7 is not a sealed crime scene in any forensic sense. It is a functioning part of the habitat, a workspace, a storage area, a corridor that connects 2 other modules. Sealing it off permanently isn't an option because the crew needs access to the equipment and supplies stored inside. Every hour that passes introduces contamination, crew members passing through adjacent corridors, recycled airs, circulating particles from one module to another. The habitat's automated cleaning systems running their programmed cycles. On Earth, a forensic team can arrive and freeze a crime scene within the hour. On Mars, the crime scene starts to degrade the moment it's discovered, and there is nobody with the training or the tools to stop it. Lina performs what she can. She takes blood samples from the airlock panel. She photographs Kowalski's injuries from multiple angles. She notes the position of the body, the temperature of the module, the time of discovery. She places Kowalski's personal tablet and communication device in a sealed storage container. These are the actions of a doctor, doing her best imitation of a forensic investigator. And she knows, Chen knows, Houston knows, that none of this would meet the evidentiary standards of any serious criminal court on Earth. Chain of custody is broken before it begins. The person collecting evidence is a witness. The evidence is being stored in a container designed for soil samples, not forensic material. The photographs are taken on a standard mission tablet without any forensic imaging calibration. If this case ever reaches a courtroom, in any country, under any legal system, a defense attorney will argue that every piece of evidence collected on Mars is tainted. And that attorney will probably be right. Meanwhile, the crew of Ares base is beginning to fracture along lines that no pre-mission psychological screening predicted. Kowalski was popular. He was the person who fixed things, the one who could repair a malfunctioning air filter with spare parts and patience, the one who organized movie nights in the common module on Saturdays. His death has removed something from the crew that doesn't show up on any systems diagram. The social glue that made 14 people from 8 countries feel like a single unit instead of strangers sharing a pressurized box. Suspicion spreads silently and unevenly. The German communications specialist, Richter, is aware that others saw his argument with Kowalski, and he can feel the glances. Dr. Vasquez, who found the body, notices crew members avoiding her, either out of sympathy or because some part of their survival-trained brains has flagged the person who discovered the victim as a potential suspect. The Brazilian botanist, Souza, stops eating meals in the common area. The Russian engineer, Andrei Volkov, retreats to his workspace and barely speaks. These are not the behaviors of suspects. They are the behaviors of human beings, trapped in a sealed environment with a dead colleague and a growing awareness that one of the people they depend on for survival may have committed murder. Commander Chen recognizes the pattern from his crisis psychology training. Trust is collapsing. And on Mars, trust isn't a luxury, it is infrastructure. Every system on Ares base requires cooperation. The water recycler needs maintenance from engineering. The food production lab depends on coordination between botany and medical. The power grid is monitored in shifts by crew members who must trust each other with their lives every time they hand off a watch. When trust breaks, cooperation breaks. When cooperation breaks, systems begin to fail. One death can cascade into many if the social fabric tears fast enough. 41 minutes after Chen's transmission, Houston responds.
Ares Base, this is Houston. We copy your report. We are assembling a legal advisory team and consulting with partner agencies. Commander, you are authorized to use emergency protocols to maintain crew safety. Preserve all available evidence. Restrict crew movement as operationally feasible. We will follow up within 6 hours. Stand by.
Stand by. 2 words that sound routine on Earth, the kind of thing you hear when you're on hold with a customer service line. On Mars, stand by means, we don't know what to do either, but we're working on it, and the answer is at least 6 hours away. In 6 hours, the evidence will degrade further. The crew's psychological state will deteriorate further, and the suspect, whoever it is, will have 6 more hours to consider their situation inside a habitat where there are no locked doors strong enough to hold someone who truly wants to get out. Chen closes the channel. He looks at Lena, still kneeling beside the body. He looks at the blood on the airlock panel. He looks at the camera in the corner of Module 7, its red indicator light blinking steadily, recording everything and explaining nothing. 14 people, 8 countries, 1 dead body, and the nearest courtroom is 225 million kilometers away, across a gap that light itself takes over 12 minutes to cross. The law says someone has jurisdiction. Physics says it doesn't matter. the news reaches Earth in fragments. First, an encrypted status update from Ares base to NASA's Deep Space Network. Then a leak. Someone at Mission Control tells someone else, who tells a journalist who runs the headline before any agency is ready. Within hours, every news outlet on the planet carries the same story. A crew member has been killed on Mars, and the circumstances suggest murder. The details are sparse. The speculation is not. Social media becomes a storm of theories, accusations, and geopolitical anxiety. And in government offices across 8 countries, phones start ringing simultaneously. Because the question that lands on every desk is the same one Commander Chen asked from Module 7, just framed in the formal language of international diplomacy. Whose case is this? The answer, under current law, depends on which legal theory you apply. There are 5 that could plausibly determine who gets to prosecute a crime committed on Mars. Each one has centuries of precedent behind it. Each one has been used successfully on Earth to resolve jurisdictional disputes between nations. And each one, when applied to the specific conditions of Ares base, leads to a dead end. The first and most intuitive theory is territorial jurisdiction. This is the principle that governs nearly every criminal case on Earth. The crime happened here, so the laws of here apply. It's the reason a theft in Paris is prosecuted under French law, and an assault in Buenos Aires is prosecuted under Argentine law. Territorial jurisdiction is the default setting of criminal justice, so deeply embedded that most people assume it's the only way law works. You commit a crime on someone's land, that someone's courts deal with you. The problem was established by Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, and it's absolute. Mars is not sovereign territory. It cannot be claimed, owned, or governed by any nation. The ground beneath Module 7, the ground where Kowalski's blood pooled, belongs to no government. Territorial jurisdiction requires territory, and Mars, in the legal sense, has none. The most fundamental and widely used principle in criminal law is simply inoperable. It's like trying to plug a device into a wall that has no outlet. The device is perfectly functional. The wall just doesn't have what you need. The second theory is nationality jurisdiction, also called active personality jurisdiction. Under this principle, the suspect's home country has the right to prosecute. It doesn't matter where the crime occurred. What matters is who committed it. Many countries use this principle routinely. France, for example, can prosecute a French citizen for crimes committed anywhere in the world, regardless of local laws. Germany, Japan, and Russia have similar provisions. The logic is straightforward. You carry your country's laws with you, the same way you carry your passport. Applied to Mars, nationality jurisdiction seems like the cleanest solution. If Andrei Volkov, a Russian citizen, is the suspect, then Russia prosecutes. Simple, except it isn't. Because nationality jurisdiction assumes you can identify the suspect's nationality clearly and unambiguously. For the current crew of Ares base, that's mostly possible. Volkov is Russian. Vasquez is French. Kowalski was Polish. But this is the first generation of Mars missions. What about the second or the third? What happens when children are born on Mars? Children who have never visited Earth, who hold no passport, whose parents may come from different countries with conflicting citizenship laws. Some nations grant citizenship by blood. If your parent is a citizen, you are too, regardless of where you're born. Others grant citizenship by birthplace. If you're born on the nation's soil, you're a citizen. Mars is nobody's soil. A child born on Mars to a Brazilian mother and a German father might be entitled to Brazilian citizenship, German citizenship, both, or, depending on the specific legal frameworks at the time, neither. A second-generation Martian could be functionally stateless, a person with no nationality at all. and nationality jurisdiction cannot prosecute a person who has no nationality. The theory collapses the moment Mars produces its own people, rather than borrowing them from Earth. The third theory flips the equation. Passive personality jurisdiction, sometimes called the victim's nationality principle, gives the victim's home country the right to prosecute. Kowalski was Polish, so Poland gets the case. This principle is less universally accepted than the first two, but it's used. The United States, for instance, claims the right to prosecute anyone who kills an American citizen abroad, regardless of where the killing took place or the suspect's nationality. On Earth, passive personality jurisdiction works because it's backed by enforcement mechanisms. If an American is killed in a foreign country, the US can request extradition, a formal foreign legal process by which the suspect is transferred from the country where they are to the country that wants to try them. Extradition treaties between nations make this possible. It's often slow and sometimes politically complicated, but the mechanism exists. From Mars, extradition is a physical impossibility. The suspect is 200 million kilometers from the nearest extradition hearing. The next available transport to Earth doesn't launch for 11 months. Even if every nation on Earth agreed tomorrow that Poland should prosecute, a unanimous consensus that has never occurred in the history of international criminal law. Poland could not physically take custody of the suspect for nearly a year, and during that year, the suspect is confined on a base where the only person qualified to maintain critical life support systems is the suspect himself. Poland's courts might have the legal authority, in theory, to demand Andrei Volkov's presence. Physics overrules that authority completely. The fourth theory is universal jurisdiction, and it is the most powerful tool in international criminal law. Universal jurisdiction allows any nation to prosecute certain crimes, regardless of where they occurred, who committed them, or who the victim was. It exists because the international community recognizes that some acts are so severe, so fundamentally offensive to human civilization, that every nation has a stake in punishing them. The crimes covered by universal jurisdiction are specific: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, piracy, torture, and slavery. Murder is not on that list. This might seem surprising. Murder is the most serious crime in virtually every legal system on Earth. But universal jurisdiction was designed for atrocities, acts that shock the collective conscience of humanity, and that national courts might be unwilling or unable to prosecute. A single murder, however horrific, does not meet that threshold under current international law. Expanding the list to include murder committed in outer space would require a new international agreement negotiated among dozens of nations, ratified by their legislatures, and integrated into their domestic legal systems. That process, based on historical precedent, takes decades. The International Criminal Court, the institution most closely associated with universal jurisdiction, took over 50 years from initial proposal to its first operational case. Mars will be colonized long before universal jurisdiction evolves to cover crimes committed there. The fifth theory is the one most legal scholars consider the best available option, and it's the one already embedded in Article 8 of the Outer Space Treaty, the law of the flag. A habitat on Mars under this model functions like a ship at sea. The nation whose flag it flies has jurisdiction over everything that happens inside. An American-built habitat is American legal territory. The same way, a Japanese-flagged oil tanker in the Indian Ocean is Japanese legal territory. The law of the flag has a long and functional pedigree. Maritime law has used it for centuries to resolve exactly this kind of problem. Crimes committed in spaces that belong to no nation. It works because ships are, historically, built by one country, registered in one country, and crewed by people who are connected to that country's legal system. The flag is clear. The jurisdiction is clear. The model is clean. Until you look at Ares Base. The habitat modules were manufactured by a private American company, Helios Dynamics. But Helios Dynamics is incorporated in Delaware, operates its engineering division in Texas, sources components from factories in South Korea and Germany, and receives 30% of its funding from the European Space Agency. The rocket that delivered the modules was built by Arianespace, a European launch provider. The mission itself was organized by an international consortium with 12 member nations and 4 corporate partners. The life support systems inside the habitat were designed by a Japanese subcontractor. The communications array was built in Canada. So, whose flag does Ares Base fly? America's, because the primary contractor is American. Europe's, because the rocket was European. Japan's, because the life support is Japanese. The law of the flag assumes a clean answer to the question of ownership. Modern space missions, built on layers of international cooperation and corporate partnerships, do not provide clean answers. They provide tangles, and every thread in the tangle leads to a different courtroom, in a different country. With a different legal tradition, there is an additional complication that the maritime analogy doesn't anticipate. Ships have owners, ships are registered. A ship flying a Panamanian flag is, legally, Panamanian territory, even if it was built in China and crewed by Filipinos. The registration is the deciding factor. But there is no equivalent registration system for Mars habitats. The Outer Space Treaty requires nations to register objects launched into space, and the 1975 Registration Convention established a framework for doing so. But registration was designed for satellites and spacecraft, discrete, single-owner objects. A Mars habitat built by an international consortium with shared ownership doesn't fit neatly into a registry designed for a satellite launched by one country. If 3 nations and 2 corporations co-own the habitat, who registers it? Under whose flag does it operate? The Registration Convention doesn't say, because in 1975, the question was inconceivable, and beneath all of these legal theories lies a deeper, more uncomfortable reality. The question of jurisdiction is not purely legal. It is political. When the news of Kowalski's death reaches Earth, it doesn't land in a vacuum. It lands in a world of competing national interests, geopolitical rivalries, and domestic politics. Poland demands justice for its citizen and leverages the case to assert its standing in the European Union. Russia resists any jurisdiction that would place its citizen in a foreign court, invoking its long-standing policy of refusing to extradite Russian nationals, a policy enshrined in the Russian Constitution. The United States argues that since an American company built the habitat, American law applies, and quietly recognizes that the precedent set by this case will shape the legal architecture of Mars for generations. China, through Commander Chen's dual citizenship, has a foothold in the case and views it as an opportunity to establish Chinese legal influence beyond Earth. France insists on protecting the rights of its citizen, the key witness, and pushes for an international tribunal. Each nation's legal position is shaped by its strategic interests as much as by the law. This is not cynicism. This is how international law has always functioned. The rules are real, but the enforcement of those rules is inseparable from power, diplomacy, and national ambition. On Earth, these negotiations happen in slow motion, through diplomatic channels, international courts, and treaty negotiations that can take years. During those years, the case sits in limbo. Evidence ages. Witnesses' memories shift. Political priorities change. Cases that depend on international jurisdictional agreement have a well-documented tendency to collapse under their own procedural weight. On Mars, 14 people cannot wait for that process. The body is in Module 7. The suspect is somewhere in the habitat. The crew is deteriorating psychologically by the day, and 5 legal theories, each one rational, each one grounded in centuries of precedent, are pointing in 5 different directions simultaneously, like a compass with 5 needles spinning in a magnetic storm. Commander Chen doesn't know any of this yet. He doesn't know about the diplomatic cables or the emergency sessions at the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. He doesn't know that Poland's foreign ministry has issued a formal statement or that Russia's ambassador has called an emergency meeting with NASA's administrator. All Chen knows is what he can see: a dead crew member, a frightened team, a habitat that still needs to function, and a communication delay that turns every question into a 40-minute guessing game. He makes a decision. He identifies the most likely suspect based on what he has. Surveillance gaps, crew movements, interpersonal conflicts documented in the mission log. And he acts. Because on Mars, waiting for Earth to resolve a legal problem that Earth has never resolved before is not an option. The colony needs someone in charge. The crew needs a decision. And the closest thing to a legal system on this planet is a mission commander with a tablet, a flashlight, and the authority of a position that was designed to manage science experiments and habitat repairs, not to stand in for a judge, a jury, and a police force all at once.
Mission Control, this is Commander Chen. I have restrained the suspect and isolated them in the storage bay of Module 3. I am requesting legal guidance. Please advise.
22 minutes later, Houston responds.
Ares Base, this is Houston. We are consulting with legal. Stand by.
Stand by. The same 2 words carrying the same hollow promise. On Earth, they mean patience. On Mars, they mean the system you were counting on doesn't have an answer, and it might not have one for a very long time. Andrei Volkov is sitting on an equipment crate in the storage bay of Module 3. His wrists are bound with cargo straps, the kind designed to secure supply pallets during transit, not to restrain a human being. There are no handcuffs on Mars. There was never a reason to pack them. The storage bay is approximately 4 meters by 3 meters, lined with sealed containers of spare parts, dehydrated food reserves, and backup filtration cartridges. The air is colder here than in the rest of the habitat because the bay's thermal regulation runs at a lower priority than the crew quarters. Volkov can hear the hum of the life support system through the wall. The same system he maintains. The same system that is keeping the person who locked him in here alive. Commander Chen sealed the door from outside. There is no lock on it. Module 3's storage bay was designed for inventory management, not detention. Chen has welded a maintenance bracket across the doorframe using a portable fabrication tool, creating a physical barrier that will hold under normal force, but would not survive. A determined effort by a trained engineer with access to the tools stored on the other side of the wall. Chen knows this. Volkov knows this. The arrangement holds together through an unspoken agreement that both men understand. Volkov stays because, for now, staying is the least dangerous option for everyone. This is what passes for incarceration on Mars. A cargo room, a welded bracket, and a mutual understanding. Chen didn't want this. Nothing in his training prepared him for the act of physically confining another human being. He is a mission commander, a role modeled after the captains of naval vessels and the commanders of Antarctic research stations. His authority is broad but operationally defined. He can order crew members to perform tasks. He can reassign duties. He can declare emergencies, ration supplies, and restrict access to specific modules for safety reasons. These powers exist in mission protocols developed by NASA, the European Space Agency, and the consortium that organized the Ares mission. They were designed for scenarios like equipment failure, medical emergencies, psychological breakdowns, and environmental hazards. They were not designed for murder. The concept of commander authority in extreme environments has a long history, and almost all of it comes from the sea. For centuries, the captain of a ship in open water held extraordinary powers. Powers that, on land, would belong to courts, police, and governments. A captain could confine a mutinous sailor. A captain could perform marriages, conduct burials, and in some legal traditions, authorize the use of lethal force to maintain order. These powers existed for a practical reason. The ship was beyond the reach of any shore-based authority, and someone had to make decisions. The ocean didn't wait for lawyers. Space agencies borrowed heavily from this tradition when they designed command structures for long-duration missions. The ISS commander has authority over crew safety and station operations. Russian space law, inherited from the Soviet program, grants the mission commander particularly broad emergency powers, including the authority to take any action necessary to preserve the crew and the mission. American protocols are slightly more constrained, requiring the commander to consult with mission control before making major decisions. But the underlying philosophy is the same across every space agency. In an emergency, the commander acts and the legal details are sorted out later. The problem is that later has always meant when the crew returns to Earth. On the ISS, that's hours or days. On Mars, it's months or years. And the longer the gap between action and legal review, the more the commander's emergency authority starts to resemble something else entirely. Something that looks less like crisis management and more like unilateral governance. Chen is now functioning as police, detective, prosecutor, judge, and jailer. He identified the suspect. He gathered what evidence he could. He made the decision to detain. He chose the method of detention. He is managing the rest of the crew's access to the suspect. He is deciding how long the detention lasts, under what conditions, and what happens next. Every one of those functions on Earth is performed by a separate institution, deliberately separated to prevent any single person from holding too much power over another person's life and liberty. The entire architecture of due process is built fragmentation. The person who investigates is not the person who prosecutes. The person who prosecutes is not the person who judges, and the person who judges is not the person who punishes. These separations are not bureaucratic inconveniences. They are the core mechanism that prevents justice from becoming tyranny. On Mars, all of those separations collapse into one man standing outside a welded door. And Chen is aware of something else. Something that complicates his authority even further. Ares Base was not built by a government. It was built by Helios Dynamics, a private aerospace company headquartered in Houston, Texas. The habitat modules, the life support infrastructure, the power systems, the communications array, all of it is corporate property. Helios Dynamics designed it, manufactured it, and transported it to Mars under contract with the international consortium that organized the mission. The company's logo is stamped on every module wall. Its proprietary software runs the environmental controls. Its employee manual, a 200-page document that every crew member signed before departure, includes a code of conduct, a dispute resolution procedure, and a clause that grants the company's ground-based management team final authority over all operational decisions affecting company assets. Under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, the United States bears responsibility for Helios Dynamics activities in space, because Helios is an American company, but that responsibility is supervisory not operational. The US government didn't build Ares Base. It didn't select the crew. It didn't design the mission protocols. Helios Dynamics did all of that with government oversight that, by the time the mission launched, had become largely procedural. The relationship between the US government and Helios Dynamics is not the relationship between a state and its citizens. It's the relationship between a regulator and a regulated entity. The distinction matters immensely because the rights of the accused are defined by the state, not by the corporation. Volkov, sitting in Module 3, has no access to legal counsel. He has not been formally charged with any crime under any nation's law. He has not been informed of his rights because it is unclear which nation's rights apply to him. He has not been given an opportunity to present his account of events to an impartial authority because there is no impartial authority on Mars. Commander Chen is his jailer, and Commander Chen is also the person who decided he was the suspect. The investigation, the arrest, the detention, and the judgment all flow from the same individual, and that individual is operating under the emergency protocols of a mission plan written by a private company. Helios Dynamics Code of Conduct includes a section on crew misconduct. It permits the mission commander to restrict a crew member's access to facilities and systems, and to reassign duties or confine a crew member to designated quarters in the interest of crew safety. These provisions were written for scenarios like psychological episodes, equipment sabotage, or serious insubordination. They were not written for homicide, but in the absence of any applicable criminal law framework. The company's code of conduct is functionally the highest authority governing Volkov's detention. A corporate human resources document is serving as the legal basis for imprisoning a man suspected of murder on another planet. The absurdity of this is not theoretical. It has concrete consequences. Corporate policy does not include the right to a trial. Corporate policy does not include the presumption of innocence. Corporate policy does not prohibit self-incrimination or guarantee the right to confront one's accusers. Every legal system in the democratic world, American, European, Japanese, Brazilian, enshrines these protections as fundamental rights. They exist because centuries of human experience have demonstrated that, without them, people in power will inevitably abuse that power, consciously or unconsciously, with the best of intentions or the worst. Due process is not a technicality. It is the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that learned, through immense suffering, what happens when one person is given unchecked authority over another. On Mars, that accumulated wisdom is absent. Volkov is being held by a commander operating under corporate guidelines in a facility owned by a private company on a planet where no constitutional protections have ever been established. His confinement may be reasonable. Chen genuinely believes Volkov is dangerous, and the safety of 13 other people depends on that judgment being correct. But reasonableness is not the same as legality. A reasonable action taken without legal authority is still an extra-legal action. And if Volkov is ultimately proven innocent, the question of what was done to him and under whose authority will become a legal crisis in its own right. Houston's legal advisory team is beginning to grasp this problem. In a secure conference room at Johnson Space Center, lawyers from NASA, the Department of Justice, Helios Dynamics Corporate Legal Division, and the State Department are seated around a table, joined by video link to counterparts in Paris, Warsaw, Moscow, and Beijing. The conversation is going in circles because every proposed course of action runs into the same wall: authority. If Chen is acting as a law enforcement officer, under whose law is he enforcing? If Volkov is detained, under whose legal system does he have the right to challenge his detention? If evidence is being collected, which country's rules of evidence apply? If Volkov confesses, or if Chen pressures him into a statement, is that confession admissible in a Russian court? A Polish court? An American court? Each legal system has different standards for what constitutes a coerced confession, different rules about the presence of counsel during interrogation, different thresholds for what evidence is admissible and what must be excluded. A statement that is perfectly legal under one country's rules might be thrown out entirely under another's. And behind the legal discussion, a larger strategic conversation is happening. Helios Dynamics' legal team is quietly concerned about liability. If the company's code of conduct is being used as the legal basis for Volkov's detention, and if that detention is later found to violate his rights under Russian or international law, Helios could face lawsuits from Volkov, from the Russian government, or from international human rights organizations. The company's general counsel has already flagged the possibility that Volkov's detention, technically authorized by a corporate policy document, could be legally classified as unlawful imprisonment. On Earth, unlawful imprisonment is a criminal offense in every jurisdiction. The person who carried it out could face prosecution. The institution that authorized it could face civil liability. The irony is staggering. The attempt to respond to one crime on Mars could create an entirely separate crime under the laws of Earth. Meanwhile, Russia's position is hardening. The Russian constitution explicitly prohibits the extradition of Russian citizens to foreign countries. This is not a negotiable principle. It is a constitutional mandate that no Russian president or parliament can override without amending the constitution itself. Russia's diplomatic message to the consortium is blunt. Andrei Volkov is a Russian citizen. If he is to be tried, he will be tried in a Russian court under Russian law by Russian judges. Any attempt to subject him to another nation's legal system will be treated as a violation of his constitutional rights and an affront to Russian sovereignty. Poland's response is equally firm. Tomasz Kowalski was a Polish national. Poland invokes the passive personality principle. The victim's nation has a legitimate claim to jurisdiction. Polish law permits prosecution of crimes committed against Polish citizens abroad, and Poland's Ministry of Justice has formally requested that all evidence collected on Mars be preserved and transmitted to Warsaw for independent analysis. The request is technically reasonable. It is also technically impossible to fulfill under current conditions, because the evidence was collected by a French doctor using a mission tablet, stored in containers designed for geological samples and catalogued under protocols that no Polish court has ever validated. And in the background, a question is forming that nobody in the conference room wants to articulate out loud, because articulating it would mean admitting something that the entire international space community has avoided confronting for decades. Is it possible that the first serious crime on Mars will go unprosecuted? Not because the suspect is innocent, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because no legal system on Earth can establish the authority to try the case. The precedent that would set is terrifying. If a murder on Mars cannot be prosecuted, then Mars becomes a space beyond law, a zone where the most serious crimes carry no legal consequences. That outcome would undermine the legitimacy of every future Mars mission, every private investment in Martian infrastructure, and every international agreement governing human activity in space. It would tell every future colonist that the protections they grew up with, the right to justice, the right to safety, the right to live under a system that punishes those who do harm, end at Earth's atmosphere. Volkov shifts on his equipment crate. The storage bay is getting colder. Through the wall, he can hear the hum of the water recycling system, the rhythmic pulse of the pump he installed himself, running the filtration cycle he calibrated 3 months ago. He knows the sound the way a musician knows a familiar melody. And he knows something that Chen, Houston, and every lawyer in that conference room will discover soon enough. That pump has a maintenance cycle. It needs recalibration every 31 days. The last recalibration was 28 days ago. In 3 days, if nobody adjusts the pump's pressure differential, the primary filtration membrane will begin to degrade. In 10 days, the water output will drop below the minimum threshold for 14 people. In 21 days, the backup reserves will be empty, and the only person who knows how to perform the recalibration is sitting in a cargo room with his wrists bound by straps designed to hold supply pallets. Day 31 arrives on schedule. The water recycling system doesn't care about jurisdictional disputes, diplomatic cables, or the body still sealed inside the cold storage unit of Module 7. It cares about pressure differentials and membrane integrity. And on the morning of Sol 879, exactly 3 days after Volkov's detention, the primary filtration pump begins to whine, a high-pitched oscillation that every crew member can hear through the habitat walls. Within hours, the water output drops by 12%. By evening, it has dropped by 23%. Dr. Vasquez runs the numbers on her tablet. At current consumption rates, carefully rationed since the crisis began, the crew has approximately 18 days of drinkable water remaining before the backup reserves are exhausted. 18 days. On a planet where the nearest body of liquid water may not exist at all, and where extracting moisture from the Martian soil requires equipment that is itself dependent on the water recycling system to function. The arithmetic is simple and merciless. Without Volkov, the colony dies. Not in a dramatic, sudden catastrophe. Slowly, over the course of 3 weeks, as the water becomes undrinkable, the food production greenhouse dries out and 14 human bodies begin to shut down from dehydration. Commander, Chen stands outside Module 3 and faces a decision that no training manual, no mission protocol, and no legal system on Earth was built to address. He can keep Volkov confined and preserve the integrity of the detention, honoring whatever thin thread of legal process exists on Mars, while the water supply collapses around them. Or he can open the door, cut the cargo straps, and ask the man suspected of murdering Tomasz Kowalski to please fix the machine that keeps everyone alive. There is no good option. There is only a choice between 2 kinds of failure.
Houston, this is Commander Chen. The primary water filtration system is degrading. I need Volkov to perform the recalibration. Requesting authorization to temporarily release the suspect under supervised conditions. I need a response on this one, Houston. We don't have time to wait.
20 minutes of silence. Then,
Ares Base, Houston copies. Commander, you are authorized to use your judgment. Maintain visual supervision of the suspect at all times. Document everything. We understand the situation. Do what you need to do.
do what you need to do. That phrase carries an enormous weight because what it really means is, we don't have an answer for this either, so we're putting the decision back on you. Houston's legal team has spent 3 days arguing in circles. They cannot tell Chen whether releasing Volkov constitutes a breach of detention protocol, because there is no detention protocol for Mars. They cannot tell him whether supervised release creates a legal liability, because the question of which law governs the detention has not been resolved. They cannot tell him anything useful, so they tell him to use his judgment, which is what he has been doing since Kowalski's body was found, because there has never been anything else to use. Chen opens the door. Volkov looks up from the equipment crate, His wrists are raw from the cargo straps. He hasn't slept properly in 3 days. The storage bay has no bed, no blankets, and the temperature dropped to 14 degrees Celsius overnight. He looks at Chen. Chen looks at him. Neither man speaks for a long moment. Then Volkov stands, rubs his wrists, and walks to the water recycling station in Module 5. Chen follows 2 meters behind, carrying a wrench in one hand and a tablet in the other. Documenting everything, as Houston instructed, while holding the closest thing to a weapon that a Mars habitat can offer, Volkov works for 6 hours. He disassembles the pump housing, recalibrates the pressure differential sensors, replaces a worn gasket in the membrane assembly with a spare from his personal toolkit, and runs 3 test cycles to verify the output. The whine stops. The water flow returns to nominal levels. 14 people will continue to have drinkable water. The colony survives. And when Volkov finishes, Chen escorts him back to Module 3, replaces the cargo straps, and welds the bracket back across the door. A suspected murderer just saved the lives of the people holding him captive. And now he's back in a cargo room, waiting for a justice system that doesn't exist to decide his fate. This moment, this impossible, absurd, deeply human moment, captures the fundamental problem of justice on Mars. Every legal system on Earth is built on a principle so basic that it's rarely stated explicitly. The community can survive without the criminal. When a person commits murder in London or Lagos or Lima, that person can be removed from society. Arrested, tried, convicted, imprisoned. The city goes on. The economy functions. The water still flows. The lights still work. Removing one person from a community of millions has no measurable impact on the community's ability to survive. Punishment, in all its forms, imprisonment, exile, execution, depends on the assumption that the individual is dispensable to the collective. Mars inverts that assumption entirely. In the early years of colonization, every crew member is the opposite of dispensable. Each person represents a decade of specialized training that cannot be duplicated. Each person carries knowledge and skills that exist nowhere else on the planet. Volkov isn't just an engineer. He is the engineer, the only human being within 200 million kilometers who understands the water recycling system at the level required to keep it running. Remove him, and you remove the colony's ability to produce clean water. Imprison him permanently, and you sentence 13 innocent people to a slow death alongside him. The equation is brutal in its clarity. On Mars, punishing the guilty can kill the innocent. This isn't a new problem in human history, but it has never existed at this scale or with this level of inescapability. Analogies from Earth offer partial insight but no real solutions. Consider a submarine on a months-long deployment beneath the Arctic ice. The crew is small, isolated, and interdependent. If one crew member assaults another, the captain can confine the offender and redistribute duties. But a submarine carries redundancy. Multiple engineers, multiple technicians, overlapping skill sets designed specifically to ensure that the loss of any one person doesn't cripple the vessel. And critically, the submarine can surface. It can rendezvous with a support ship. It can cut the deployment short. The isolation is severe, but never absolute. Antarctic research stations provide another comparison. Crews of 20 to 40 people spend months cut off from the outside world during the polar winter, when no aircraft can reach the station. Incidents have occurred: assaults, psychological breakdowns, at least 2 documented cases of interpersonal violence at Soviet and Russian Antarctic stations. In each case, the station commander managed the situation through confinement and crew separation until evacuation became possible. The solution was always the same: contain the problem and wait for extraction. The waiting period was measured in months, not years. and the skills on the station were distributed broadly enough that removing one person didn't threaten the survival of the rest. Mars offers neither redundancy nor extraction. A crew of 14 cannot carry duplicate expertise for every critical system. The mass constraints of interplanetary travel make that impossible. Every kilogram launched to Mars costs thousands of dollars. Every seat on a Mars-bound spacecraft represents a choice. Do we send a second water systems engineer, or do we send a geologist who can analyze soil samples for signs of microbial life? Do we send a backup electrician or a botanist who can increase crop yields by 15%? The missions are designed around the assumption that every crew member will be available for the full duration. The removal of even one person from the operational roster cascades through every system the colony depends on, and the emotional dimension is equally impossible. The 11 crew members, who are neither the victim nor the suspect, have spent 2 years living with both of them. They trained together on Earth for 3 years before that. They've shared meals, celebrated birthdays, mourned the distance from their families, and relied on each other through dust storms, equipment failures, and the grinding psychological pressure of living in a sealed box on a planet that is actively trying to kill them every second of every day. Kowalski was their colleague and their friend, and Volkov, the man who may have killed him, is also their colleague, also someone they've trusted with their lives. And now also the person who just saved those lives by fixing the water system. How do you process that? How does the Brazilian botanist, Souza, sit across the table from Volkov at dinner, knowing that he might have murdered Kowalski, but also knowing that without Volkov's expertise, the greenhouse water supply would have failed within days? How does the German engineer, Richter, look at Volkov and see a potential killer while simultaneously relying on Volkov's maintenance reports to verify the integrity of the air filtration system? The crew cannot separate their feelings of fear and grief from their practical dependence on the suspect. The two are welded together as firmly as the bracket on Module 3's door. Some legal scholars have argued that this problem, the essential personnel dilemma, makes traditional Earth-based justice fundamentally incompatible with early Mars settlements. The models we have simply don't translate. Retributive justice, which focuses on punishment proportional to the crime, requires the ability to impose meaningful consequences on the offender. Imprisonment on Mars isn't just impractical, it's potentially suicidal for the colony. Exile is impossible. There is nowhere to go. Execution, even in the jurisdictions that permit it, would permanently destroy a critical resource for the colony and raises moral questions that no Earth-based court has ever had to weigh against the survival of an entire settlement. What remains is something closer to restorative justice, a framework that focuses on repairing harm rather than inflicting punishment. Restorative justice has roots in indigenous legal traditions from New Zealand, Canada, and parts of Africa. It emphasizes dialogue between offender and victim's community, accountability through action rather than confinement, and the reintegration of the offender into the social fabric. On Earth, it's used primarily for lower-level offenses: property crime, juvenile cases, community disputes. Applying it to murder is controversial even in the cultures that practice it most extensively. On Mars, it may be the only option that doesn't destroy the colony. A restorative framework would require Volkov to acknowledge the harm he's caused, participate in a process designed by and for the crew, and accept conditions. Perhaps permanent monitoring, restricted access to certain modules, mandatory psychological evaluation that allow him to continue contributing to the contingent colony's survival while bearing consequences for his actions. It isn't satisfying in the way that a prison sentence or a courtroom verdict is satisfying. It doesn't deliver the catharsis of seeing a guilty person locked away, but it keeps the water running, the air flowing, and the crew alive. This tension between the justice we want and the justice we can afford has a historical parallel that illuminates where Mars is headed. When European colonists settled in the Americas, they initially operated under the laws of their home countries. British colonies followed English common law. Spanish colonies followed the laws of the Indies. French colonies followed the coutume de Paris. For the first generation, this worked well enough. Because the colonies were small, the populations were directly connected to Europe, and the systems they brought with them fit the conditions they faced. But over time, conditions diverged. The distances grew, local challenges, climate, indigenous relations, resource scarcity, governance of populations that included people from multiple national backgrounds created pressures that the home country's legal system couldn't address. Slowly, unevenly, and often messily, the colonies began developing their own laws. Massachusetts established its body of liberties in 1641. Virginia developed its own criminal code. Over decades, these local systems diverged further and further from the European originals until they became something new. Legal frameworks shaped by the specific conditions of the places where they operated rather than the traditions of the places their creators came from. Mars will follow the same trajectory, compressed and amplified. The pressures that took colonial societies generations to encounter: isolation, resource scarcity, multicultural populations, distance from centralized authority, will hit Mars colonists from day one. The legal frameworks they bring from Earth will strain immediately because those frameworks assume conditions: large populations, ample resources, rapid communication, available enforcement mechanisms that Mars does not provide. The evolution from borrowed law to indigenous law, which took centuries in the Americas, may take decades on Mars. Perhaps less. Legal scholars have given this inevitable future a name: Lex Martialis, Martian law. A governing system created by and for the people of Mars, responsive to Martian conditions, designed around the constraints of Martian life. It would require a legislature to write laws, a judiciary to interpret them, and an enforcement mechanism to carry out the sentences. All built from scratch. All operating in an environment where every resource is measured, every person is counted, and the margin between survival and catastrophe is thinner than the walls of the habitat. Lex Martialis is not a theory. It is an inevitability. The only question is whether it will emerge through deliberate design, crafted by thoughtful people before the crises arrive, or through desperate improvisation written in the aftermath of tragedies that could have been prevented. At Ares Base, the answer to that question is already clear. Lex Martialis is being written right now, in real time, by a commander with a welded door and a suspected murderer who fixes the water. It's being written by a doctor who collects evidence in soil sample containers, by a crew that eats dinner with a man they fear, by a planet that offers no escape and no precedent. The law on Mars will not look like the law on Earth. It can't, because on Mars, justice is not an abstract principle debated in comfortable courtrooms. It is a survival calculation performed every day by people who cannot afford to get the math wrong. Let's step out of Ares Base for a moment. Out of Module 7, away from the blood on the airlock panel, past the welded bracket on Module 3's door, through the thin Martian atmosphere, and back across 200 million kilometers of empty space to Earth. Because the scenario we've been walking through, Lena, Kowalski, Chen, Volkov, the jurisdictional nightmare, the water crisis, the impossible mathematics of justice, is not an exercise in imagination. The timelines that make it real are already running. and they are running faster than most people realize. SpaceX's Starship is the largest and most powerful rocket ever built. It stands 120 meters tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty, and it is designed from the ground up for one primary destination, Mars. Elon Musk has stated publicly, repeatedly, and with increasing specificity that SpaceX intends to land humans on Mars within this decade. The vehicle has already completed orbital test flights. The refueling architecture, which requires multiple Starship launches to fill a single vehicle's fuel tanks in orbit before it departs for Mars, is under active development. The production line in South Texas is building Starship vehicles at a pace that treats interplanetary travel as an engineering problem to be solved through iteration, the same way SpaceX solved reusable rockets with the Falcon 9. Whether Musk's specific timelines hold or slip by a few years is almost irrelevant. The hardware exists. The trajectory is clear. The question is not whether Starship will reach Mars, but when NASA is approaching the same destination through a different path. The Artemis program, originally designed to return humans to the Moon, is explicitly structured as a stepping stone to Mars. The agency's long-term roadmap envisions crewed Mars missions in the late 2030s, building on the infrastructure, experience, and international partnerships developed through lunar operations. NASA's approach is slower, more methodical, and more dependent on government funding cycles. But it carries the institutional weight of the world's most experienced space agency and the partnerships of over 24 nations that have signed on to the Artemis framework. China's space program has published its own Mars timeline, and it is accelerating. After successfully landing the Zhurong rover on Mars in 2021, making China only the second country to operate a rover on the Martian surface. The China National Space Administration announced plans for a Mars sample return mission, and beyond that, crewed missions targeting the 2030s to 2040s. China's space program operates with a level of state-directed funding and strategic commitment that is largely insulated from the political cycles that affect NASA's budget. When China announces a space timeline, it tends to meet it. 3 separate programs. 3 different engineering philosophies. 3 distinct political motivations, all converging on the same planet within roughly the same window of time. And behind these government-led efforts, a growing constellation of private companies, Blue Origin, Rocket Lab, Relativity Space, and dozens of smaller ventures, are building the supply chain that will make sustained Mars operations possible. Launch costs are dropping, payload capacities are rising. The economic case for Mars, once confined to academic papers and billionaire ambitions, is beginning to attract serious investment capital. The people who will set foot on Mars are alive today. Some of them are in graduate programs studying planetary science. Some are in flight schools. Some are in engineering labs, designing the life support systems that will keep them breathing. The first generation of Martian settlers is not a hypothetical future population. They are a demographic that already exists, scattered across universities and training programs and aerospace companies around the world, moving steadily toward a departure date that is measured in years, not generations, and the legal system that will govern their lives when they arrive. It does not exist. This is not an exaggeration. It is not rhetorical emphasis. It is a literal description of the current state of space law as it pertains to permanent human settlement on another planet. The legal frameworks that could address criminal jurisdiction, civil disputes, property rights, governance structures, labor laws, family law, and the 1,000 other legal questions that arise the moment human beings start living somewhere permanently. None of these frameworks have been written for Mars. Some of them have been discussed in academic journals. A few have been the subject of conference papers at space law symposiums attended by a few hundred specialists. Virtually none have advanced to the level of formal international negotiation. The most significant recent development in space governance is the Artemis Accords, a set of bilateral agreements initiated by the United States in 2020. The Accords establish principles for cooperative lunar exploration, including provisions for resource utilization, heritage site preservation, transparency, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. Over 30 nations have signed them. They represent a genuine step forward in space governance, and they have been rightly praised for creating a framework outside the slow machinery of traditional United Nations treaty negotiation. But the Artemis Accords are designed for the Moon, not for Mars. They address cooperation between nations on short-duration science missions, not the governance of permanent multicultural settlements. They say nothing about criminal law. They say nothing about what happens when someone is born on another celestial body. They say nothing about the rights of individuals living under corporate-built infrastructure on a planet where no government has sovereignty. The Accords are a useful tool for the problem they were designed to solve. The problem of governing human life on Mars is orders of magnitude larger, and the Accords don't touch it. The traditional mechanism for creating international space law is the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, SUPOS. This committee produced the Outer Space Treaty, the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, and the Registration Convention. These four instruments, along with the failed Moon Agreement, constitute the entirety of binding international space law. They were all negotiated between 1967 and 1979. In the 47 years since the Registration Convention was adopted, COPUOS has not produced a single new binding treaty on space governance. The committee still meets, it still discusses, it produces reports, guidelines, and non-binding recommendations. But the consensus-based process that COPUOS requires, where any single member nation can effectively block progress, has made it structurally incapable of producing the kind of comprehensive legal framework that Mars demands. The math is alarming when you lay it out plainly. The last binding international space law treaty took approximately 12 years from initial proposal to final adoption. The International Criminal Court, the most relevant precedent for a new international judicial body, took over 50 years from first serious discussion to its first operational case. The European Union's legal framework, governing cooperations between nations with broadly similar legal traditions on a single continent, took decades of negotiation and is still evolving. These are the timescales at which international law moves. The technology that will put humans on Mars is moving in years. There is a gap between those two speeds, and it is widening every time a Starship engine fires on a test stand in Texas. Some experts argue that this gap is not just a bureaucratic inconvenience, it is a structural threat to the future of human civilization beyond Earth. The legal vacuum on Mars will not remain empty. Vacuums never do. If international law doesn't fill it, something else will. Corporate governance, mission commander authority, informal crew agreements, the cultural norms of whichever nation contributes the most settlers. Some combination of these forces will rush in to fill the space where law should be. And history suggests that governance systems created under pressure, without deliberate design, tend to favor the powerful over the vulnerable, the majority over the minority, and the expedient over the just. The colonization of the Americas provides the most instructive and most cautionary parallel. When European powers established settlements in the New World, the legal frameworks they brought were designed for European conditions. Over time, the unique pressures of colonial life, distance from the home country, interactions with indigenous populations, resource extraction economies, the mixing of populations from different national backgrounds created governance challenges that European law couldn't address. The responses varied enormously. Some colonies developed relatively inclusive legal systems. Others devolved into authoritarian rule by commercial enterprises. The Dutch East India Company governed entire territories as a corporate state, with profit motives overriding the rights of the people living under its authority. The British East India Company did the same across South Asia, wielding sovereign power, without democratic accountability for over 2 centuries. The echoes of that history are audible in the structure of current Mars mission planning. Private companies are building the habitats. Private companies are designing the life support systems. Private companies will, in many cases, select the crew members, fund the missions, and establish the operational rules that govern daily life on Mars. The Outer Space Treaty makes governments responsible for these companies' activities, but responsibility without operational control is a weak instrument. If Helios Dynamics, or any real-world equivalent, establishes the first permanent habitat on Mars, the de facto governance of that habitat will be shaped by corporate policies, employment contracts, and codes of conduct drafted by lawyers in Houston or Hawthorne or Shenzhen. Constitutional rights, democratic representation, judicial independence. These concepts exist in national legal systems, not in corporate charters. The window for proactive legal design is not infinite. There is a period, right now, in these years, before the first permanent settlements are established, when it is still possible to create governance frameworks through deliberate, inclusive, international negotiation. Once people are living on Mars, the dynamics change. Settlers will have immediate needs and limited patience for diplomatic processes that take decades. Local governance will emerge organically, shaped by whoever has the most power, the most resources, or the most people on the ground. The opportunity to shape Martian governance through principled design rather than reactive improvisation exists today. It will not exist forever. Some proposals are on the table. Legal scholars have suggested a Mars Governance Convention, a new international treaty specifically designed for permanent off-world settlements, addressing criminal jurisdiction, civil law, property rights, resource extraction, citizenship, and the relationship between Earth-based governments and Martian self-governance. Others have proposed a phased approach, beginning with bilateral agreements between the first Mars-faring nations and expanding to a multilateral framework as the settler population grows. A few have argued for a radically different model, granting Mars settlements autonomous governance from the beginning, treating them as independent political entities rather than extensions of Earth nations, on the theory that the unique conditions of Martian life will inevitably produce a society that cannot be governed by distant institutions. Each proposal has merit. Each faces enormous political obstacles, and each requires something that is currently in very short supply: urgency. The governments and institutions capable of creating these frameworks do not yet feel the pressure to act, because the crisis hasn't happened yet. Kukolsky is still alive. Volkov is still a trusted colleague. Ares Base is still a blueprint. The murder hasn't occurred, so the legal gap remains theoretical. An interesting academic topic discussed at conferences, not a screaming emergency demanding immediate legislative action. This is the paradox of prevention. The best time to build a fire escape is before the building is on fire. The best time to write the laws governing Mars is before the first crime is committed, the first child is born, the first property dispute erupts, The first corporation asserts authority over a settlement it funded. Every year that passes without a comprehensive legal framework is a year in which the foundations of Martian governance are being laid informally by engineers and executives and mission planners who are solving immediate technical problems without the legal infrastructure to support the human society. Those solutions will create. The rockets are nearly ready. The habitats are being tested. The crew selection processes are underway. The supply chains are forming. Every piece of the technical puzzle is falling into place with remarkable speed and coordination. The only piece that's missing is the one that determines what kind of civilization those rockets will carry to Mars. Whether it will be a society governed by laws designed for human dignity or a frontier governed by whoever gets there first with the most resources and the fewest constraints, the clock is ticking. It has been ticking for years, and the distance between where the technology stands and where the law stands grows wider with every successful test flight, every new funding round, every milestone that brings humanity closer to Mars and further from the legal frameworks that were supposed to arrive first. The engineers are doing their job. The scientists are doing their job. The investors are doing their job. The lawyers, the diplomats, and the lawmakers have not yet started theirs.
Commander's log, Sol 847, supplemental. Kowalski is dead. Andre is in Module 3. Houston says they're working on it. The crew is scared. I'm scared. And the worst part isn't that someone killed him. The worst part is that nobody, not a single person on this planet or the one we came from, knows what happens next.
Chen records the log entry and closes the tablet. The common module is empty. It's 0240 Aries local time, and the rest of the crew is in their quarters. Some sleeping, most not. The lights in the corridor are dimmed to their nighttime cycle, casting a faint amber glow across the walls. Through the narrow porthole beside the comm station, the Martian surface stretches out under a sky the color of rust and bruise. There is no wind tonight. The dust has settled. From inside the habitat, the planet looks almost peaceful. A vast, quiet emptiness that doesn't know or care that 14 people's alive. 14 are living through the worst days of their lives on its surface. Kowalski's personal belongings are still in his quarters. His boots are beside the door, placed neatly the way he always left them. His tablet sits on the fold-down desk, the screen locked, the last message he typed still unsent. A photograph is taped to the wall above his bunk. His parents, standing in front of a house in Krakow, smiling into the camera with the particular pride of people whose son was selected for a mission to another planet. Lena sealed the room 3 days ago. Nobody has gone in since. Nobody wants to. In Module 3, Volkov is awake. He fixed the water recycler 12 hours ago and was returned to the storage bay immediately after. The cargo straps are back on his wrists, though Chen loosened them slightly, this time. A small concession that neither man acknowledged. Volkov stares at the ceiling and listens to the hum of the pump through the wall. The rhythm is steady. The calibration is holding. He knows it will hold for another 31 days. After that, someone will need to open this door again, because the machine doesn't maintain itself, and nobody else on this planet knows how. This is the texture of the problem. Not the grand legal theories debated in conference rooms on Earth. Not the diplomatic cables, or the jurisdictional frameworks, or the scholarly articles about Lex Martialis. The texture is a man staring at a ceiling in a cargo room, listening to a machine he built, knowing that the people who locked him up will need him again before this is over. The texture is a commander sitting alone in an empty module. At 2 a.m, recording a log that he suspects no court will ever admit as evidence for a case that no nation may ever prosecute. The texture is a doctor who cannot unsee the blood on the airlock panel, who washes her hands 4 times a day now, even though they were never dirty, who lies in her bunk and replays the moment she walked into Module 7 and tries to imagine a version where she walked in 30 minutes earlier and Kowalski was still alive. The texture is human, and the gap in the law is human too. Created by humans who didn't think far enough ahead, maintained by institutions that move too slowly, and about to be exposed by the species' oldest failing, our capacity to harm each other, even in the most extraordinary circumstances, even 200 million kilometers from home. We have always done this. Every frontier humanity has ever crossed has carried violence with it. The first sailors to cross the Atlantic brought murder aboard their ships. The first settlers in every colony, on every continent, confronted the question of justice in places where the old rules didn't reach. The California Gold Rush, the Australian penal colonies, the Antarctic expeditions, the deep-sea oil platforms. Every time human beings have pushed into a new environment, they have brought their conflicts with them. And every time, the legal systems they left behind have struggled to follow. Mars will be no different. The planet is new. The technology is extraordinary. The distances are staggering, but the people are the same people they have always been, capable of brilliance and cooperation and sacrifice, and equally capable of jealousy, rage, fear, and the kind of darkness that ends with blood on an airlock panel. The engineering that gets us to Mars is the product of our best qualities. The murder that will eventually happen there will be the product of our worst, and the measure of our civilization will not be determined by whether we can prevent that murder. We probably can't, but by whether we've built a system capable of responding to it with something that resembles justice. Right now, that system does not exist. The Outer Space Treaty provides a framework for nations, not for people. The ISS agreements provide a model for laboratories, not for societies. The Artemis Accords provide principles for cooperation, not for criminal prosecution. Every legal instrument we have was designed for a version of space exploration that is rapidly becoming obsolete. A version where astronauts are temporary visitors. Missions last months, instead of lifetimes, and the distance from Earth is measured in minutes of communication delay, rather than months of physical separation. The version that's coming is fundamentally different. Permanent settlements, multicultural populations, children born on Martian soil, economic activity, property disputes, family law, labor rights, civil liberties. The full spectrum of human social complexity transplanted to a planet with no atmosphere, no liquid water on the surface, and no legal infrastructure. We are about to export civilization to Mars, and we are doing it without the single most important component that makes civilization function. A system of laws that the people living under it can trust. The crew of Ares Base didn't ask for this burden. They signed up to explore a planet, to conduct science, to push the boundary of human achievement. They trained for dust storms, radiation exposure, equipment failure, and the psychological strain of long-duration isolation. They did not train for the moment when one of them would kill another, and the entire architecture of human justice would reveal itself to be useless at the distance they're operating. And yet, here they are. 13 people and a dead man sealed inside a pressurized habitat on a frozen desert, waiting for 2 planets to figure out something that should have been figured out decades ago. The scientists did their part. The engineers did their part. The astronauts did their part. The lawyers, the diplomats, the legislators. They were supposed to do their part too. They were supposed to build the legal scaffolding before the building went up. They didn't, and now the building is standing on Mars. and the people inside it are discovering, in the worst possible ways, that the scaffolding was never built. The first murder on Mars will not just be a crime. It will be a mirror, held up to every institution, every government, every international body that had the opportunity to prepare and chose to wait. It will force a reckoning with the gap between our technological ambition and our institutional readiness. It will ask a question that sounds simple, but has no easy answer. If we are advanced enough to send human beings to another planet, why aren't we advanced enough to govern them when they get there? Kowalski deserved better. He deserved to live and work on Mars under a legal system that could protect him. He deserved to know that if something happened to him, there would be a clear, fair, functioning process to hold the responsible person accountable. He deserved the same thing every person on Earth takes for granted: the quiet, invisible assurance that somewhere, someone has jurisdiction, someone has authority, and someone will pursue justice on your behalf. That assurance doesn't exist on Mars. It doesn't exist for Kowalski, and it doesn't exist for the thousands of people who will follow him there in the coming decades. Volkov, too, deserves something. If he's guilty, he deserves a trial, a real one, with evidence evaluated by trained professionals, a defense attorney arguing on his behalf, and a verdict rendered by an impartial body operating under laws that were written before the crime occurred. If he's innocent, he deserves exoneration, not months of confinement in a cargo bay, judged by a commander who was never trained to judge, under rules that were never designed for this. Guilty or innocent, Volkov deserves a legal system. He doesn't have one. The distance between Earth and Mars will shrink over time. The rockets will get faster. The communication technology will improve. Settlements will grow from outposts to towns to cities. And one day, probably within the lifetime of people watching this right now, Mars will have its own laws, its own courts, its own constitution. A legal civilization built from the ground up by people who had no choice but to build it, because the one they inherited from Earth simply stopped working at the edge of the atmosphere. But that day is not today. Today, the law ends where the sky begins. And somewhere in the future, on a cold Martian evening, much like the one Commander Chen is living through, right now, someone will die, someone will be accused, and the 200 million kilometer gap between the crime and the nearest courtroom will ask humanity the only question that has ever truly mattered about our journey to the stars. Are we ready? We are not. But the rockets are launching anyway.